Okay, welcome to the show. A very special guest with me today, Sam Federman, who is a student at Syracuse University and also writes for Mid Major Madness, which is one of my favorite Twitter accounts and accounts on the web. Sam, thanks for joining me.
Of course, anytime.
So you we're gonna do a little bit before we talk about brackets. We do a little bit about you. So you are currently a student, but also you covered the MAC tournament
Yep.
this during spring break. You
Yep.
got a nice hat out of it, and you were at the Ivy League final, right?
Yeah. So I've been covering college basketball now for the last couple of years, and I've basically become the de facto Mac beat writer slash Mac like leading insider slash leading analyst of the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference men's basketball over the course of the last few years, and I love the league. I'm from right outside of New York City, so the teams are very close to me, so I can go to a lot of their games when I'm home, and that's kind of what I did for the last couple of years. And this year, finally got the chance to spend the entire week in Atlantic City for the MAC tournament, and it was awesome.
That's fantastic. And so how did you get into that? Because you're pretty young to be covering that beat.
Yeah, I mean, I just a couple of years ago, I wanted to create like a sports section at my school, at my high school's newspaper, and I wanted to do some stuff there, but like they didn't really have they didn't really think that it was necessary, or they didn't think that the newspaper was in transition at the time, so they weren't
Mm-hmm.
really looking to add a ton of stuff. So I
Sure.
basically decided, you know what, I'm going to do something on my own. I'm just going to start going to college basketball games and writing about them. And it got to a point where I was going to enough that I reached out to Mid Major Madison and said, hey, do you need another writer? And then for the 22-23 season, I started writing for them and went to 53 games last year. I'm at 89 right now this year, and
Wow.
writing a lot about the league and other stuff in the Northeast, and Northeast basketball. It doesn't get better than that.
Right. And I mean, that's just a fantastic way to learn on the job. You're probably learning more in those games than you are in a lot of your classes.
At the moment, yeah, but again, the classes I haven't really gotten into the point where I'm at the journalism level classes yet. I'm only a freshman, so
Oh,
we
wow.
haven't we haven't really gotten to my specific classes, just kind of the basic and filling the requirements.
Are your professors, do they encourage? I'm guessing they've got to encourage this sort of thing.
I mean, I don't really talk about, I don't really tell my professors that like, hey, this is what I do in like a personal setting. Like, I'll mention it in if like it relates to what's going on in the class, but like my teachers in high school that I talked to about it loved it. All the people I work with love me for doing it, and I think it's really fun to do, and people really seem to enjoy the coverage.
Sure. Yeah, when I was in college, I was the play-by-play guy for the men and the women's basketball team. So I just spent a lot of time on buses in Ohio. But what you're doing is a level up from that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
All right. So let's talk about the brackets because some of us have been paying a lot of attention to college basketball, like you, and some of us have been paying a lot of attention to high school basketball and are now just getting caught up. So I thought I would have a college basketball expert on to sort of run through the brackets a little bit. And here's my very first question is, what the hell happened with Indiana State?
well, Indiana State is a really fun team, and they had a really great record, and they had some really good metrics, but they had a couple. Their resume was basically entirely built on things that they did in Missouri Valley Conference play, which is it's a fun conference, but it's it's not a power conference.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good mid major league, and for Indiana State, the fact that they had games against Alabama and Michigan State in the non conference, and they lost those games. They only have one win in quadrant one, which was against which was against Bradley in league play. And the fact is, with the amount of bid stealers that we had, Indiana State was never going to get in after really Thursday because of how
Okay.
many bubble teams won on Thursday and got to the semifinals of their league. And then with the bid stealers, it put the nail in the coffin. And Indiana State's really fun. I think Josh Schertz is an excellent coach. They play a super spaced out offense where all five guys can really shoot the cover off the ball. But it makes sense why they're not in the tournament. They're a tournament caliber team, but
Hmm.
it was a strong bubble this year.
Right. And so they had them on, if I remember correctly, they had them on the last four out
Yeah, I
line
think
in
they
the
were in the
selection
first
show.
four,
In
which
the first
means
four out.
essentially if there were 5 teams that, according to the selection committee, stole bids this year. That would be UAB in the American, New Mexico in the Mountain West, which is ridiculous. They should have been in regardless.
Hmm.
And hold on, NC State in the ACC,
NC State.
Oregon in the Pac-12, and Duquesne in the A10. So if a couple of those teams didn't win their conference tournament, Indiana State would be in.
So if Duke shows up in the quarterfinals, then we're maybe not having this conversation.
Yeah.
So here's my question. So if you're that close and you're the committee, right? And so they're clearly in the mix. And do you think there's an element where they were going, hey, this is like one of the best stories of the year, this team. Why don't we find a way to get them in? Because it seems like from some of the other ones that it's sort of hit or miss, or there's a lot of different criteria being applied depending on which team you're looking at. Like if you're looking at it like Michigan State, they seem to be playing by different rules than other teams are. How hard would it have been for them to just go, hey, let's just give the people what they want and put them in the first four or something?
Well, if you're pointing directly at Michigan State beat Indiana State by double digits in December.
Right.
And like Michigan State has really good predictive metrics. They're 18th in Ken Palm. They're pretty high in the net. But yeah, they don't have a good resume. Indiana State has some solid resume metrics, some solid predictive metrics. But let's be honest. If you hear the discourse around college athletics and the administrators, the selection committee, they're not putting in mid majors if there's they would rather have high majors than mid majors.
Right.
This story element doesn't really mean anything to the committee. Which
And
again, I don't think a team should get in based on their story. It shouldn't
right.
happen. A team should get in based on how good they are. Indiana State is a team that is good enough to make the NCAA tournament, but they fell in a year where it was a really tough bubble and a bunch of bid stealers, and they lost by a couple points in their conference championship game to a really good Drake team. It happens. There's
And that
been
was a
great teams left out before, and Indiana State's just going to be added to that list. And hey, they get to play in the NIT. At least their season's not over like some other teams.
What do you make of the teams not going to the NIT after they made all this fuss to get them in the NIT?
I think that it just proves that the NIT means infinitely more to the mid-major schools than it does to the high-major schools. And thus, it's ridiculous that the NIT rules changed. And I think at some point, hopefully they change them back to get the conference champions who didn't win their conference tournaments into the NIT.
Yeah, that always struck me as kind of a weird decision because I mean these are really good teams. You're trying to make the NIT struggling already for relevance. It's not the old days where the winner of it got an automatic bid to the tournament or anything like that.
Yeah, I
So
mean, you look at the NIT and you see, all right, where does the NIT sell? The NIT gets good crowds at Liberty when they play against Villanova, but the NIT is not getting a good crowd when Michigan is hosting Toledo.
right,
Those were 2 games from last year.
because the Michigan Toledo fans are just annoyed that they're not in the tournament in the big
Yeah,
dance.
I mean, when Michigan's hosting an NIT game in Ann Arbor, nobody cares. But when Liberty is hosting an NIT game in Lynchburg, those fans are going to show up.
Yeah, if Maine was in the NIT, we would be very excited about that.
Maine would draw
But
in the NIT.
oh yeah, we would do great in the
But
NIT.
it would also be very, very unlikely that they'd be a host at any point.
Right.
Because they'd have to be a top 4 NIT seed to host, and if they ever win America East regular season, it would probably be a terrible year for the America East.
Well, unless we get better.
Given the fact that Vermont has just dominated that league, that's not a slight to Maine, but like
Right.
given the fact that Vermont has dominated the league and given it a floor,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that if Maine were to win it, I don't think Maine would probably be. If Maine gets to a top 100 team at some point, awesome, that's tremendous. But even then, they're probably not hosting if they're like 99th in Ken Pom. You gotta Maine is a fun program. I think Chris Markwood has it going in the right direction, but
Mm-hmm.
like it would take a lot for them to host an NIT game, or even win a regular season title, given how good Vermont, Lowell, and Bryan are in that league.
Yeah, I think it's a long road for that program, but it seems to be going in the right direction, which is encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you did your predictive brackets, and so how did you do in that? How many did you get in?
In my prediction, I had 66 of 68, which is
Wow.
not good
Oh,
considering
it's not good. Okay.
it's fine. It's fine. Like it's a wrap because you usually you know all the auto bids obviously, and
Right.
you know basically most of the teams that are going to get in as at larges. I thought that there were a couple teams for one spot. I thought Oklahoma was fairly safe, but they were not. And I thought St. John's would get in over Texas A&M, and they did not. And St. John's was not even in the first four out, according to the selection committee, which really surprised me. And Texas A&M got a 9 seed, which also really surprised me.
And St. John's, they're like top 25 in Ken Palm, something like
Yeah, they
that.
have really good predictive metrics. They've been playing significantly better basketball over the last month. They won 6 games in a row before losing by 5 to UConn in the Big East semifinals. It was their first Big East semifinal appearance since before I was alive.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Jeez.
that program is looking a lot better than it was a year ago because Rick Pitino's the head coach now, and even though they didn't make the NCAA tournament, it's definitely this season. Definitely St. John's basketball. There's a buzz around St. John's that hadn't been there in a while.
Right, right. So who's the team? Give me a team that you would take out
Of
that's
the
in the
NCAA
tournament right
tournament.
now. Yeah.
Virginia, without a doubt.
Okay.
I
That was
I
my
think
thinking.
Virginia. If you look at where Virginia ranks in Ken Palm, they are 69th in Ken Palm. That is 44 spots lower than St. John's. Virginia is a team that since February 13th, they've lost at home to Pitt by 35 to Virginia Tech, at home to North Carolina by 25 to Duke. They went to overtime with Boston College in the ACC tournament, and they lost in overtime to NC State in the ACC tournament. They also lost by 20 to Memphis and Notre Dame in the non-league. Memphis in the non-league, Notre Dame in the second game of league play. But both of those teams were not close to the tournament. They lost to them by 20. Memphis, obviously, a lot better than Notre Dame, but regardless of that, that's 2 losses that are. I mean, Memphis, I think, might have been quad 1 since it was an away game, but
Hmm.
lost it by 20. And Notre Dame, they lost by 20. That's a bad loss. And they lost early in the season to Wisconsin. There are a plethora of games where this team did not score 50 points. There's also a plethora of games where this team did not allow 50 points. They are basically they're the 194th ranked offense in the country, the 7th ranked defense, and they don't belong. Like their metrics are not there. They have some solid resume metrics. I think their strength of record is fine, but they lose blowouts. They lost a lot of games by a lot of points to teams that really no one was considering tournament teams, like Virginia Tech and Notre Dame and Memphis, and they lost by a lot and they lost obviously by a lot to Duke. And I don't think this team has looked like a tournament team over the last month. Maybe early February, I was starting to turn around on them, think that they were looking really good, but then they played a terrible mid-February into March, and I think they played themselves out of the NCAA tournament, but the committee disagreed.
Why do you think they kept him in? Is it just because they're in the ACC?
No, I mean, I don't think it's because they're in the ACC that they were kept in. I think that they have there's they do have that strength of record is pretty. It's 29th in strength of record. They played their average net loss is 51, so it's not like they were losing to a ton of terrible teams. They were losing to mostly teams that were fine. But like they only had 2 quadrant 1 wins. They didn't have any losses outside of the first 2 quadrants. But I think that the fact that their losses were by so much made made the efficiency metrics and predictive metrics worse, while the fact that they didn't take any bad losses made the resume metrics look better. And
Hmm.
I do think that, and like, look, their quad one wins were February 3rd by 1 point and November 10th by 3 points, and that they haven't won they've lost their last three quadrant one opportunities, and they lost those games by 25, 10, and 35. So that's like the fact that the committee was looking at the strength of record for them and putting them in, not the efficiency metrics. And I think that there's some criteria that works, some doesn't. And for Virginia, the committee seemed to err on the side of the resume metrics.
So can you explain, because the quad wins are new-ish, right? They're like a couple
Five,
years
6 years
old,
old. Yeah.
5, 6 years old, right? So they're, when you get old like me, that's new. Um, what are the quad, like? What is that? Because
So it's
I
based.
vaguely know it, and I know my like mother doesn't know it at all.
So it basically takes so every team in the country has a net ranking.
Hmm.
The NCAA evaluation tool. Nobody knows the exact formula, but it's like it's an efficiency metric combined with with a little bit of a resume metric in there. It's not quite like KenPom, but it's KenPom adjacent.
Right.
And based on those rankings, um, and where the game is played, home, neutral, or away, a game is assigned to a quadrant. So if you're playing against a top 30 team in the net at your home arena, that is a quadrant one game. 31 to 75 at home is quad two. But if you play the 73rd ranked team away, that at the 73rd ranked team's place, then that's quad one. It goes 1 to 75 quad one for away games. And I they did have some people, like I think they hired out an outside firm to kind of like figure out what the best buckets for the quadrants were, because that's at least what I gathered when I reached out and said, hey, where, like, are the quadrants arbitrary? And they were like, no, we had some research, we did research. And so quadrant one is like your highest level games.
Hmm.
Quadrant two is your second highest, and then quadrant four. Like if you lose a quadrant four game, that's a home game to 161 or below, 201 neutral or below, 241 away or below. That would be a really really bad loss.
If you lose to Maine at home, it's not good.
That would be a bad loss. Maine is 234 in the net, and they are one of the reasons why South Florida is not in is not in along with Central Michigan and Hofstra and UMass. Those teams and Tulsa. Those are some. UMass is you. If I'm going to mention UMass, I'll mention UAB. Basically, South Florida's losses were not to great teams,
Right.
or at least great teams in the national landscape. UMass is a good team in their league. Central was a good team in their league. Hofstra was a good team in their league. But in the national landscape, no.
So your quad one win could disappear late in the year and turn into a quad two win.
That is correct. And actually, for Texas A&M, they on Friday they woke up with 5 quad one wins. On Saturday, they woke up with 7 because they picked up a quadrant one win on Friday. They beat somebody in that quarterfinal. They beat Kentucky in the quarterfinal, and Florida moved up to the top 30, and they have a home win over Florida. So that happened for them. But teams can also move out. Like Mizzou was dangerously close to falling below the 161 mark. They fell all the way to 158 in the net, 159 in the net at one point, and they have a road win at Pitt, and that game is just a couple KenPom spots, a couple net spots away from having been a quad four loss for a Pitt team that was on the bubble.
So
And
that would have been really bad for them. But
they ended up not making it anyway. But that really would have been really bad. And Mizzou went 0-18 in the SEC. They were a really tough watch in that league this year, and
But
they went on the road and beat Pitt in the early season.
is it weird that though, like, so you lose to a team and they're like a quad 3 team, and then they drop below a quad to a quad 4 team, and there's just, it's whatever side of the line on it. It seems weird to me that that's such a big difference
I
when we're
agree.
talking about like one or two spots in an overall ranking.
I've been saying this for a long time. I don't like the quad system. I
Okay.
think that it doesn't. I mean, I don't think it really makes any sense. It's an interesting sorting mechanism, but
Right.
the amount of weight that gets put on it, it really doesn't make sense as to why it's used so much, because it is, again, like, is there a road win at so basically beating Houston, Kansas's win over Houston at Allen Fieldhouse counted the exact same in the in the net, sorry, in the quadrant system as let's just pull up as let's see, who did Richmond, as UMass's win over Richmond at the Robins Center.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
It shouldn't. It shouldn't. That should not be how it works.
I mean, it
And
seems like a thing that you would have to look at and you go, oh, look at that. They have 5 quad wins. Isn't that great for them? Or maybe a thing that you would use to sort of get some context of a team's season. But it seems weird to me that that's a thing that's determining whether or not your season continues.
yeah, I've been thinking, especially after yesterday, that maybe we're better off with this being a math problem,
Yeah.
because there's so much subjectivity in here. Why don't we
Mm-hmm.
just put together something that can take out the subjectivity and just say, all right, this is the formula to winning. But then again, their teams would find ways to exploit that system. It would probably either overvalue or undervalue certain aspects of scheduling, certain aspects of conferences, and that's why I maybe would have pause going to that. But
Mm-hmm.
like, the committee did a brutal job this year.
It
That's
does.
my
It looks like people are pretty annoyed. I mean,
Yeah,
it seems like
especially
you
with
could
some of
just
the
go with
people.
Ken Palm.
I mean, I don't think you can just go with Ken Palm, because I mean, I don't think that I do think that what you do, like who you beat, who you lose to, how many games you win, how many games you lose, that has to matter at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, like, I think there's some really good teams out there. Like, I don't think that the fact that, say, like Auburn, they're 27-7, they're fourth in Ken Palm. They're a 4 seed, and they're a 4 seed for a reason. They lost a lot of quad. They were 3-7 in quad one. They didn't pick up a ton of big wins until the end of the season in the SEC tournament, and they lost a bunch of close games. They really struggled in close games. So them on the one line would be a little bit disrespectful to some teams that have better resumes than them, did better things than them, even though Auburn's really, really good. I mean, you can't just use Ken Palm to determine everything. It
Right.
should definitely, but Ken Palm's on the team sheet. It is something that is used to determine this, but it's not and like Michigan State lost 14 games. They're 18th in Ken Palm. That's like that would be a 5 seed, I think, if Ken Palm determined everything.
Right.
They wouldn't deserve that. But the fact that they are 18th in Ken Palm also shows maybe some color to the fact that, hey, their resume doesn't match the predictive metrics. Maybe we'll meet somewhere in the middle.
Right. Because you would tend to then regress to the predictive metrics and not in reverse, and not go
Yeah,
away from them.
theoretically you would. There are definitely teams out there that have tricked the computers over the years.
Mm-hmm.
But like, if you look at UConn last year, they were a Ken Palm darling all year. Even when they lost. They were 5-6 in the Big East. They'd lost 6 games of their last 8 after a home loss to Xavier, and they were still 6th in Ken Palm at that point. And they were fourth going into the NCAA tournament, and they got a 4 seed. And honestly, somewhat similar to the Auburn team. They really struggled in close games last year, but that UConn team also had some better wins in the earlier in the season than Auburn did, and throughout the season than Auburn did, I would say. And I also think that they were better coached and did a lot of other things better.
Well,
But
having Dan Hurley probably helps.
yeah, but and a lot of people before that tournament run didn't agree with that.
I'm an old school Hurley fan of the whole family, so I was like, I don't like UConn, but I was like, oh, they got Dan Hurley. That's gonna be good for them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a UConn fan, so it's been my
You
thing
were
for
you were very
forever.
excited then.
I was so excited. Hurley was one of the guys I wanted back when the job was open. I had a couple of names in mind. It was a long time ago. I was very young, so I didn't. I mean, I wasn't very young. I was young, so I
He's
didn't
been there a
really
little
know.
bit, yeah.
I didn't really know I didn't really know exactly why I wanted Hurley. I didn't know why I wanted some of the guys I wanted, but I'm glad that they did hire Hurley.
The real pity with Ken Palm is like 15 years ago, you could win your bracket just by using Ken Palm as your source because no one knew what it was. And so you'd have people just picking wild things, and you're like, oh no, this team is terrible, actually. They're way overseeded, and the seeding was even worse than it is now. And you could pretty reliably pick upsets, and now everybody uses it, so it's kind of lost
Yeah,
the secret
I'm
sauce.
looking at 2010 right now. New Mexico was 43rd in Ken Palm and got a 3 seed and got killed in the second round by
Yep.
Washington. That's an interesting. That was one of the first years I filled out a bracket. I do not remember who I picked that year to win that part of the bracket though. But like yeah, you keep looking down. You've got a bunch of crazy stuff in terms of seeding around here.
Oh yeah, there was like these dark ages that before you remember of analytics where people were like, analytics, that's garbage.
They still do that.
They win games. That's all they do, and then they would not win games because they
I
would
mean,
run
I do
into a
think
good
winning
team.
matters. Winning
Mm-hmm.
does matter.
Sure.
But like, and I think back to Providence a couple of years ago when they won the Big East outright at 14-3, and they went into the tournament 25-5 and 50th in Ken Palm. And they got a 4 seed, but they made it to the Sweet 16 because they had voodoo magic.
Sometimes,
I
well,
do
it's tournament basketball, right? So
tournament basketball. Like
sometimes you just
that
get
Providence.
lucky.
Yeah, sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes you don't. It's all about the draw. It's all about what happens at the end of the day. Because I've been filling out brackets for a long time, and I fill out terrible brackets every year, even though I watch way more college basketball than I should.
Mm-hmm.
I can't fill out a good bracket because nobody knows what's going to happen.
Well, my wife will routinely win our bracket pool, and she watches exactly 0 minutes of college basketball. And she will, one year, she was at one point, like in the second round, she was in the top 100 on the ESPN bracket with like, she got like one game wrong out of like the first 30 or something ridiculous. She's like, I don't know. They seem good.
That's wild.
It pisses my brother off to no end because he's a
I mean,
basketball coach.
I've learned to not mind at this point
Yeah.
when I have a bad bracket. And honestly, I've overthought a lot of upsets. I've underthought a lot of non-upsets. I've but last year I thought I had a great bracket. I really I thought I had strong justifications for everything,
Mm-hmm.
and it was blown up.
I think what you
At
got
the
to
end
do
of the
is
day, at the end of the
you.
day, I care more about the process of my bracket because everyone tries to find like the secret.
Mm-hmm.
The secret, at least in my opinion, as someone who's a perennial bracket pool loser, is that there is no secret. Like there's no one formula. There's no math problem. There's no set of numbers. There's no set of vibes that will. There's definitely a there's definitely some teams that are better suited for the tournament than others, but some of those teams lose.
Yeah.
So there's really no secret. as long as I have good justifications, I feel good. But again, I'll be pissed off when I have a bad bracket, and I'll be pissed. I'm the one. A couple of things I'm pissed off about last year. I should not have had Marquette over Michigan State in that round of 32 game. It should have been obvious to me that Shaka Smart, the 215 game last year was his first NCAA tournament win in a decade, would not beat Tom Izzo in the NCAA tournament. And I convinced myself that he would. And I was
I think
wrong.
I convinced myself of that too.
And there's some other stuff last couple of years. But like the first game of the tournament last year was Maryland, West Virginia. I picked West Virginia because I thought I thought they would apply a lot of ball pressure, and Maryland didn't really have secondary ball handlers. And when they did that in the first half, they were up big, and then Maryland made some really good adjustments, and they won the game. Virginia and Furman. Furman went to a zone in the second half. Virginia had no answers. I didn't think that would happen, and Furman won the game in a really close game because K.A. Clark threw the ball up. And I picked Virginia to win that game, and you know what? I don't mind the fact that I picked Virginia to win that game. The ones that I'm mad about are like a couple years ago when I force picked Winthrop over Villanova because I watched Winthrop a couple times and I really liked them, but I should never have force picked them over Jay Wright. That was one of the stupidest things I've ever done.
How much does a coach's resume factor in when you're trying to pick a team? Because for me, like, I almost go out of my way to pick against Bob Huggins because he just perennially comes up short. And then I always remember that when he was in the NAIA, he took an undefeated Walsh team to the NAIA national tournament and lost in the first round.
Wow.
And
I
found that because when I went to an NAIA school and that was in the archives, I just found that in the archives and I went, oh, well, it all makes sense now. All those Cincinnati losses, they're all justified.
So my podcast co-host Jonathan Litzkin a couple years ago wrote his bracket Bible, which is like a list of things to look out for the bracket, and we add things to them every year. This year, one of the things that I added was everybody is a choker until they're not. And
that makes sense.
Again, I do think that it matters if you're. I think it matters if you're. I think more so than if you're a historical choker, it matters. Do I think you're a great coach? Because Matt Painter is a terrific coach, but Purdue is known as a choker. Does that mean Purdue losing to FDU last year, losing to St. Peter's the year before, losing to North Texas, does that make Matt Painter a bad coach? Or is it just, look, his teams didn't have great game plans for those games for sure. He could have done a lot better, but does one game make him a bad coach? No. Everybody is a choker until they're not. Danny Hurley lost his first two tournament games at UConn as the higher seed to Maryland in 2021 and to New Mexico State in 2022. Then he goes out and wins the national championship without playing a single close game in his third tournament with UConn. Everybody's a choker until they're not. Jim Harbaugh couldn't beat Ohio State. He could never beat Ohio State. Then he beat Ohio State.
Peyton Manning is an example.
Yeah. Everybody's a choker until they're not. Donovan McNabb in the early 2000s with the Eagles, they couldn't make it to the Super Bowl. They made like 4 NFC championships in a row, and then they made it. Andy Reid couldn't win a Super Bowl. Then he did. It happens in every sport.
And Andy Reid was one of those.
Toronto Maple Leafs, they're not going to win a series. Then they won a series.
Andy Reid's an interesting one because he was a coach where people said he's just a regular season coach and he has bad game management stuff, and that always killed him in the playoffs. And he figured it out. And sometimes figuring it out just means getting the best quarterback in the league. Yeah. Sometimes that's what figuring it out means.
I mean, the Tampa Bay Lightning lost to Columbus in 4 games. They were the best team regular season of all time. They won the cup the next year. Yeah, they won the cup the next year.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is a choker until they're not. If you think a team's good enough, don't pick them to lose because they've choked in the past. Everybody has their Gonzaga theories. Don't force pick against them if you truly think Gonzaga is really good, because like they've also made Gonzaga's also made like 7 like more straight Sweet 16s than anybody else in the country or something like that.
Something like, yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's like I don't think this Gonzaga team is particularly great, but like in the past I've liked Gonzaga. I've liked Gonzaga teams a lot. I think if I think you're a really good coach, I do think that matters. I tend to look at the quads, each pot of the bracket, which is I'm not like the sub regions, not the regions, like the
Mm-hmm.
group of 116, 8, 9, like those 2 matchups, and who's going to make it out of that quad. All right, so let's take a look, say, at the Spokane 512, 413 in the East. That's San Diego State, UAB, Auburn, and Yale. I'm not a big Bruce Pearl guy. I think Brian Dutcher's a great coach. So I think Brian Dutcher's probably the best coach of that pod. And does that mean San Diego State's going to win? No. But do I definitely consider that? Yeah. Like, I'm probably going to end up taking San Diego State to the Sweet 16, even though Auburn is going to be favored in that game if they play, because I think there's certain ways that San Diego State matches up well. There's also certain ways I think they don't match up well. That's an interesting matchup in general. But don't convince yourself that a coach is a choker just because of March Madness losses. That doesn't mean they're going to lose again. Bashir Mason in the for years had great teams at Wagner, but never made the NCAA tournament. He comes to St. Peter's year 2, and here he is in the NCAA tournament. It's not like St. Peter's is some incredible job where you get the most talented players. It's the same formula that he used at Wagner. It's just that this year he won the MAC and he never won the NEC. So everybody's a choker until they're not. I'm going to say that a million times on the show until until the bracket comes out. But that's one of the things that I think is important.
What's another one of the things from your from the Bible, the tournament Bible?
So
that's interesting. Because I like this idea.
A lot of it has to do with stuff. A bunch of it has to do with stuff from before the bracket comes out. Like, don't predetermine your first round upsets before you see their matchups, and don't pick teams to win their second game before they win their first game.
Okay.
So, like, evaluate don't say, oh, this is a Sweet 16 team. No. They have to be a round of 32 team before they're a Sweet 16 team. They have to, because you have to match up in the first round, and you have to match up in the second round.
And don't pick your upset in like mid-January because they won some big non-conference game.
Yep.
Which I did once, and it actually worked out for me. I picked Vermont. I was like, "Oh, I'm taking Vermont. I don't care."
No,
they beat
the TJ Sorensen.
Yeah, the year they actually won. Yeah, I saw them because they almost beat Kansas early.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, I'm taking Vermont if they get there because I always like to take the America East team anyway. You know? And then I'm like, no, I'm sticking with it. And it worked out, but I knew at the time this is not the smartest move in the world.
Yeah, Vermont is terrific program. John Becker is a terrific coach. I actually wrote a story previewing their game against UMass Lowell back in January. So I was texting with Becker about that, and I texted him after they won the America East, like, "Congrats, coach! You're making Death and Taxes jealous," because they win every year.
I saw that tweet. That's a nice tweet.
Yeah. And then, like, another one, don't fall in love with teams that would be satisfied with their regular season performance. And sometimes this doesn't work. Sometimes, but like a couple years ago, Illinois in 2021 and Alabama in 2021, people really liked those two teams. I actually picked Illinois to win it all. But, like, if the season ended on Selection Sunday for them, it would have been a success. And it was a success regardless of the fact that neither of them made it to the Elite Eight. Obviously, Illinois didn't even make it to the Sweet 16, and a lot of people had that being like a national championship game matchup. This last year, though, I fell for that with Kansas State. I said I thought Kansas State would be satisfied with their regular season, and I kind of talked myself into Montana State being a tricky matchup because they're really physical, and their guards the guards could really turn them over. and I picked Montana State to win that game, and Kansas State made it to the Elite Eight, and I ended up covering that regional in New York, and I love Jerome Tang, love Marquise Noel. But now you look at that Montana State team, the third and fourth arguably best players from that team are first team All Mountain West for the team that won the outright Mountain West title this year at Utah State for in Great Osibor and Darius Brown. And then obviously Raekwon Battle was really good when he played at West Virginia this year. Jubril Bello, I think he's playing pro somewhere. But like, I think that Montana State was a great team last year, but I should not have picked them to beat Kansas State because of Rule 10, and I liked and I liked Montana State. I should have kept it simple. But then again, Rule 10 also does matter. I think there are a couple teams every year where you can look at and say, keep it in mind, but maybe don't force pick against them too early.
Gotcha.
Like if for FAU, like last year, if you force picked against them because of Rule 10, that would have failed. But there's plenty of other teams that if you force picked against them based on that rule, it would work. So, I mean, like Mizzou didn't make it. Well, Mizzou lost to a 15 seed. They had a really good regular season. Then they lost to a 15 seed. They were a 7 seed, but and not many people had them making the Sweet 16 anyway. But okay, that's not a very good example. Let me just quickly find a much better example than that.
Okay.
From last year of this. I mean, people were really liked Charleston last year.
Yeah.
They had that was a predetermined upset pick that a lot of people had. Same with Oral Roberts, and those were like teams that also, well, maybe not Oral Roberts, but Charleston definitely falls into Rule 10 a little bit of that nature. And I honestly think it might be better to go back 2 years ago to find one here of a team that would be satisfied with their regular season. Oh, like Colorado State 2 years ago. I made the mistake of picking them to beat Michigan. That was a bad choice. They were definitely satisfied with their regular season in that sense. Other rules: don't sell yourself on players, sell yourself on teams. And then
I've done that so many
an
times.
addendum to that is don't convince yourself that a star has a good supporting cast in the last 2 weeks before Selection Sunday. Hello, Oklahoma State with Cade Cunningham.
UCLA with OJ Mayo at USC. Did he go to USC?
USC, yeah.
Yeah, because I was convinced him, and there was somebody who went to K-State who I was convinced was going to just carry them. Yep. And it's every year I talk myself into that. The player, they've got the great player.
Pay attention to the path that a team has to take. Every game is not independent of itself. It is independent of itself, but it also compiles enough. As you know, you run all the math problems, so you know that while each game is an independent equation, it also falls into the pot of things that have happened recently, things that have happened over the course of a season. So
it doesn't really matter that you won this particular game if you lost the 5 games around it.
I picked Arizona 2 years ago to win the national championship, and I never, ever should have picked the first-year head coach to beat Jamie Dixon, Kelvin Sampson, Jay Wright in consecutive games to make it out of that region. And I was very close to picking Villanova to win that national championship. And looking back, I think that they would have had Justin Moore not gotten hurt. But like, I shouldn't have. I loved that Arizona team, but I shouldn't have picked them to win the national championship, given how many amazing coaches they would have had to beat to get there.
Yeah, I've never even kind of thought of the path of which coaches you would have to knock off, because you run that list, you're like, oh well, no one's running that gauntlet. That's not happening.
I didn't even pick Kansas to make the Final Four that year, but Kansas was the team that made the Final Four out of the Midwest, which was the region that the South winner faced. So in that sense, you would have had to face Bill Self in the Final Four. I still think that if Ryan Kalkbrenner didn't get hurt against San Diego State in that first round game, then Creighton beats Kansas and Creighton goes to the Final Four. But yeah, he did get hurt and whatever.
Okay, so who are a couple teams you like in this bracket that we haven't talked about? Like, who do you think's got the potential to go deep,
I
or
will.
just throw some upsets at me, some 12 seeds
So,
that you like?
well, 12 seeds. I actually think the 12 seeds. There's 3 12 seeds that I think are really good this year. James Madison, McNeese, and Grand Canyon are all
Oh,
really good
McNeese, yeah.
teams. McNeese is a hyper switch everything defense with Will Wade. It's a coach that's been a high major coach. He's really good, and they have a bunch of high major caliber players.
And they
But
got a really crappy draw, right?
well, they got Gonzaga. I'm
Right. Yep.
I'm not super high on Gonzaga, but again, it's a tough draw. I mean, they were never gonna get a team that just sucks. Like
hmm
you're playing a 5 seed. These teams are 5 seeds for a reason.
Well, I think part of maybe why the 5-12 thing started was because they were seeded so badly, 20 years ago,
Yeah, I
and
mean
and so a
five
lot of these
twelve
fives
upset.
were a lot weaker than they are now.
Yeah, I mean you look at 5-12 upsets. There were none last year.
hmm That's
Now
crazy.
they typically do happen, but the other thing that I hate when people marry themselves to is they pick a game or a team to make a run based on a seed line.
hmm
Like the first thought, like one of my first thoughts when I looked at this bracket was like, there's a chance I could have all 4 1 seeds in the Final Four, and that's only happened once ever. So people
Right.
always say like, don't ever do that. But like, I've actually I'm actually somewhat considering it this year because I think North Carolina's region is just brutal. Like I think the first 3 1 seeds, UConn, Houston, and Purdue, I think are a clear top 3 teams in the country,
hmm
and I'm comfortable with them in the Final Four. I'm obviously probably there's a good chance I change one of them or 2 of them because who knows. But like with North Carolina's region, I don't believe in many of those teams at all. I think there's a solid chance we end up with a 10 or 11 seed with a 10 versus 11 Sweet 16 game between New Mexico and Nevada in that bracket. Just those teams were drastically underseeded,
hmm
and I think there's a chance we end up with that. Um,
Oh, my dogs are barking.
well, that's all right. I mean, I think look at the bracket. This is I was a lot more at peace with last year's bracket looking at it on opening night and then in the next few nights than I was with this one. This
Hmm.
bracket feels really uncomfortable for me.
Huh. In what way?
I just I feel like some of the potential upsets that I would pick, there's there's so much reason to not pick the upsets that I would pick versus like last year where I felt a lot more comfortable with taking like a Kent State or a Drake over Indiana and Miami than I am with saying, hey, let's take McNeese over Gonzaga. Even though I might still take McNeese over Gonzaga, I'm not high on Gonzaga at all.
hmm
But like, is Mark Few really going to lose to a Southland team? Is Gonzaga? Look, Gonzaga's been to the Sweet 16 how many straight years? They've won
Right.
a lot of games recently. Even though I thought they were brutal in the non-conference, they've picked it up and their predictive metrics are really good. Like, would it be just like crazy to not pick them and then like but then again, the 4-13 matchup in that bracket is Kansas, and Kansas is weaker this year because we don't know how healthy they are. They
hmm
are a very thin team, but I'm not picking Bill Self to lose to a 13 seed, right?
Right. I mean,
And
you
then
wouldn't
there,
think.
like I, I felt last year that when the bracket came out, I loved the paths to the Final Four for all 4 teams I ended up picking to make the Final Four, which were Alabama, Houston, Duke, and Gonzaga, and obviously none of them made it.
Right.
This year, UConn's path is difficult. Um, even though I think they're the best team in the country. I mean, Purdue's region is interesting. Houston has a bunch of matchups that would be fascinating as well. But like, and there's also a bunch of injuries that I don't know how much will matter. Dickinson and McCullough, Tyler Kolek, Micah Hanlockton. Well, Hanlockton's out, but so that could make an impact for Florida, but I don't know how much of an impact it could make for Florida. Then Marquette, we don't know what Kolek's status is. We don't know what Dickinson and McCullough's statuses are for Kansas. There's a bunch of stuff like that I think this year makes it challenging. And it's a really, really difficult bracket, I think, to pick this year.
Now, when you do your, let me ask you this question. So, when you do your bracket, because you're covering this as in depth as you are you doing one really well thought out bracket that you're sticking to that one, or do you sort of have 4 or 5 variants of it?
I mean, I make one main bracket.
One main bracket. Okay.
I'll make other brackets that like have other themes to them.
For the hell of it.
I always have a bracket where every year I just pick the best coach in each pod to win, to make it to the Sweet 16.
Okay.
And sometimes it does well, sometimes, and then again, a lot of times you look back after the fact, after the tournament, and you have a different opinion on the coaches, which is great, but it's also bad. How much does a sample size like that affect you? It should some, but there's also times where it shouldn't.
Well, there's the flip side of that is that it's one thing. We were talking about this with the Mr. Basketball race here. It's one thing to score 35 points on a Tuesday in January, and it's another thing to score 35 points on the bright lights of the tournament.
Yeah, but I would also argue when it comes to the Mr. Basketball thing, that's giving out an award. That's not just determining who's the best.
Right. But I mean, you learn more about someone when you're under those bright lights.
I do think there's definitely something that comes of that. But like, and there's also a lot of times the mid-major coaches that you would consider at like when you look back the best in the quads are coaches that you think are really good, but you don't really grasp how good they are until they win a tournament game or two.
Yeah, because you got to prove it, right? You got to show people that how good you are, and you got to have an opportunity to do that. And it's one thing to be good, and it's one thing to have a chance to show it.
Like, I thought Shaheen Holloway was a terrific coach even before St. Peter's made that run, but I didn't realize just how terrific of a coach he was. I thought, I mean, Dusty May is kind of a similar in a similar way to that. There's coaches that you don't realize just how good they are until they make a March run. And sometimes I think that can sway. But like, look at Brad Stevens. Like, Brad Stevens took Butler to the national championship game twice, and then a couple years later was like the best coach in the NBA.
Yeah.
So like,
and now might be the best executive in the NBA.
Yeah, that's wild. And Indiana fans are still hoping that he'll be their head coach at some point.
Yeah, I don't think that's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, what did he say to that? He said that he's a masshole now. He drinks Dunkin' Donuts exclusively.
Yeah, I saw that. I think there's a lot of wrinkles to filling out a bracket. I don't think there's one right way to do it, but I think there's a lot of wrong ways to do it.
Sure.
I think that for me, I just evaluate each game. Who's going to win each game? Who's going to win this game? Who's going to win that game? And a lot of times I'm wrong because I could do this in the regular season and be wrong.
Yeah.
And it's a one game sample. Anything can happen. And that's why we love it. Because we pick our brackets, but by day 2, like, everyone's bracket sucks. Nobody cares about their bracket. Nobody cares about their bracket after the first 15 seed or something like that wins. And obviously I'm not picking a 15 seed.
Well, I think you care about your bracket as long as you think you have a chance to win money on it.
Yes.
And when that goes out the window, you're like, well, bring it on. Bring on the chaos. Burn it all down. Give me a 16 seed in the Elite Eight. I don't care.
I believe we have two people from Maine in the NCAA tournament.
We have a couple. Yeah. There's
Estrella and Fiorillo.
Fiorello, and there's Dom Campbell is on Howard.
Oh wow, I didn't.
And then on the girls' side, or on the women's side, we have
Mackenzie
Mackenzie
Holmes.
Holmes, obviously, and Anna DeWolf at Notre Dame, and then the entire main team.
Yeah. Um, that should that's it's always fun to see like when the guys from the smaller basketball states like
Mm-hmm.
like not a lot of people live in Maine, not a lot of people live in some of these places. Like it's cool when you see those guys in the big time spotlight, but then it's also really cool to see like New York guys going to battle in New York last year with Tyson Walker and Marquise
Oh
Noel.
yeah.
And then you see like all the DMV guys who know each other growing up, and they're playing against each other in the tournament. That's also really cool. I think there's poetry to everything in college basketball. It's like to paraphrase Brad Pitt being Billy Bean, how can you not be romantic about college basketball?
Yeah. It's you sound a little bit like the kid in Almost Famous in that regard, you know. There's like it's just the enormity of it all is just wonderful in every way.
Yeah, there's so much like there's so much poetry in like Greg Campy has been coaching Oakland since the 80s, and it's just tremendous that he's able to bring them back to the tournament for the first time in 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then Matt Logie was coaching Division 3 ball and Division 2 ball, and now his first season at Montana State, he takes them to the NCAA tournament.
I just
Donald,
love that, you know, you look at like college football and they've got their little playoff thing, which is really stupid, I think. And then you look at college basketball and you've got everybody, legitimately everybody is in the tournament when you add the conference tournaments
yep.
to the mix. And, you know, a team like Maine, who was I think we were the six.
Maine was fun this year.
Yeah, I mean, but they could have gotten hot. You don't know.
It's tough in that league.
But you know what I mean? Like anyone,
is always so top heavy that like
Mhm.
if it's not if like Vermont is like really down one year, the league is probably pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
And like Vermont obviously hasn't been down in a while.
Right. But any team could theoretically get hot.
Hartford a couple years ago won that league.
UMBC?
No, Hartford a couple years ago won that league with John Gallagher. Now at Manhattan. And now Hartford is a Division 3 school.
Are they really?
Yeah.
They dropped all the way to D3?
Yeah, their president was not didn't really care for athletics.
Oh, that's weird.
For the neighborhood. The neighborhood shall live on forever. It's the Gallagher's whole thing was like we're the neighborhood team, and like then we bring in like the neighborhood guys, just like kind of like a friendly atmosphere, but like we're gonna work our butts off. And that was like the whole identity of the team. It was like hashtag for the neighborhood.
That's weird. Huh. All right. Well, I gotta let you go because I gotta go get a kid off the bus. Where can people find you?
On Twitter at Sam_Federman. I write for Mid Major Madness on midmajormadness.com, and I host the Brackets, Bubbles, and Bit Stealers podcast, which you can find at BBBCBB podcast on Twitter or Brackets, Bubbles, and BitStealers.com.
And it's everywhere you can podcast and all that. And I've subscribed to it, but I haven't listened to any episodes yet.
You should listen to one last night. We're doing another one tonight as well.
Awesome. And Mid-Major Madness is one of my favorite college basketball Twitter accounts.
Yeah,
there's always
a great job.
Do you get any input into the Twitter account, or do you just write for the site?
I mean, I text with the guy who runs the account all the time.
Okay, so you're like feeding him stuff.
Yeah, I feed him stuff, but he's tremendous. Nick watches so much basketball, but also we're trying to figure out a way for, like, I think they lost a password or something, so I can't get on the account. I'm qualified to tweet on that account. It's just
okay.
That I don't have the account.
Well, if they can't find the password, that seems like a bigger problem.
Yeah. Well, Nick has it. Nick has the account. I'm not sure if he has the password though.
I mean, I've got some accounts, some Twitter accounts that I have access to that I've lost the password to, so it makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can see that. All
I
right,
got to get
well,
back to filling out brackets and focusing and getting back and looking at the transfer portal too, because
oh geez, yeah.
it's today's portal day.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, I will let you go then. That is the show. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining me. This is fantastic. I feel like I'm all caught up now on college basketball, and I am in great position to fill out a bracket that's gonna just get destroyed.
Yep, and aren't we all?
All right. Thank you so much. I'll read the little outro thing here. This has been a production of MaineBasketballRankings.com, your source for the most comprehensive coverage of Maine high school basketball from Ashland to York and everywhere in between. This is available wherever you listen to podcasts and a bunch of places you don't. Please leave a review because it helps out with the algorithms. Tell your friends. Thanks for listening. And that's it. Thanks again, Sam.